Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found us. This is the place where we share powerful, real-life stories of betrayal, heartbreak, personal growth, and everything in between. We dive deep into the human experience, and I'm here to narrate stories that resonate with all of you. A husband's vengeful plan unfolds after discovering his wife's affair with her best friend's husband. Jason had always considered his life ideal, and why wouldn't he? At 35, he had everything he could have ever wanted: a loving wife, 2 children, a steady job, and a beautiful home nestled in the suburbs. Their life was as picture-perfect as a family could get. Sharon, his wife of over 10 years, was his rock. They'd built their relationship from the ground up, and he couldn't imagine a world without her. Their home, a cozy 3-bedroom house, was filled with laughter, late-night talks, and the constant hum of family life. The walls were adorned with family photos, and the kitchen always smelled like something warm, especially on the weekends. They'd spend Saturdays together, cooking pancakes for the kids and chatting about their week, then take long walks in the park or visit their favorite local cafe. It was a rhythm, a peaceful cadence that Jason had come to rely on. Their life wasn't flashy, but it was full. Full of love. Full of family. At work, Jason was doing well. He had recently been promoted to senior architect at his firm, which came with more responsibility but also more recognition. He had a team that respected him, and his career was on a steady upward trajectory. Everything seemed to fall into place. But somewhere along the way, things began to feel different. It started with Sharon. Sharon had always been the type of woman who took pride in her appearance, always well put together, with an infectious smile that could light up any room. But over the last few months, there was something off about her. Jason couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but he noticed subtle changes. Sharon began working longer hours at the art gallery, a part-time job she'd taken up a few years ago. It was her passion, and Jason had always supported her decision to pursue it. But lately, she'd come home later than usual, claiming she had more work or events to attend. It didn't bother him at first. She had always been independent, and he was proud of her ambition. He told himself that she was just more focused on her art, that she was caught up in a busy season. But over time, the late nights became more frequent, and Sharon's presence at home started to feel more like an absence. Their weekends, once full of family activities, became fragmented. Sharon was either busy with her gallery or off with friends. Jason tried not to let it get to him. After all, she was working hard, and life wasn't always about spending every moment together. But one small thing led to another. Sharon stopped initiating their usual date nights. They would still sit on the couch together at night, but there was no longer the same warmth in her touch. The affection that had once come so easily between them now felt like it had to be coaxed out. And even when they did talk, their conversations had become routine, surface level, like two strangers merely coexisting in the same space. Jason couldn't ignore the nagging feeling any longer. Something was off, and though he didn't want to believe it, he couldn't shake the idea that Sharon was hiding something from him. He rationalized it at first. Maybe it was just the stress of balancing work and family. But deep down, Jason couldn't help but wonder, was everything as perfect as it seemed? Little did he know, this was just the beginning. Jason's unease didn't go away. In fact, it only seemed to grow. Every day felt like he was slowly losing touch with Sharon, but it wasn't something he could put his finger on. It wasn't as if she was being overtly distant or cold. No, she was still warm and kind in the way she spoke to him. But there was a subtle shift. Something invisible but undeniable. Sharon had always been the first to wake up, to make breakfast for the kids, to organize the day. But recently, she'd started sleeping in more, leaving Jason to handle the morning routine alone. He didn't mind the extra responsibility, he was used to it. But it was strange. She'd always loved mornings, loved the quiet moments before the chaos of the day set in. Now, it was as though she was avoiding them altogether. The first time he noticed this, he tried not to think much of it. But then it became a pattern. And then there was the phone. It was always on silent, face down, as if she were hiding something. Jason had never been the jealous type. He trusted Sharon, and she trusted him. They had always been open with each other. They shared everything, the good and the bad. So why, all of a sudden, did her phone feel like a wall between them? He tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just her new job at the gallery keeping her distracted. Maybe it was just her social life picking up. She had always been close to her best friend, Emily, and Emily's husband, Tom. The two couples often hung out, had dinners together, and exchanged parenting advice. Jason was never suspicious of Tom, he considered him a friend, a brother in a sense. But something about Sharon's behavior, combined with the late nights, made him uncomfortable. One night, after another lonely dinner alone with the kids, Jason went into the living room to find Sharon on her phone again, smiling at a message she was reading. When he entered the room, she quickly tucked the phone away. Jason didn't say anything, but he could feel the shift. It was as though she was becoming more secretive, more distant, and he didn't know how to react to it. That night, after Sharon had gone to bed, Jason lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions. Was it possible that she was having an affair? He couldn't fathom it. Sharon had always been so honest, so devoted. But something was different now. There was a gap between them that hadn't been there before. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he could feel it, a shift in their dynamic that he couldn't ignore. Days turned into weeks, and Jason began to notice more signs. Sharon would come home later and later, her excuses growing increasingly thin. Oh, I had to help Emily with some things, or the gallery had a last-minute event. Jason tried to be understanding, but it was becoming harder and harder to believe her. One evening, when she was particularly late, Jason felt a strong pull to look through her phone. He hesitated. He had never been one to invade her privacy, but the gnawing feeling in his gut was too strong. What if he was wrong? What if he was just overthinking things? But his curiosity got the best of him. He sat down on their bed, picked up Sharon's phone, and unlocked it. There, in plain view, was a text from Tom. It read, "I can't wait to see you tonight. Just us, like old times." Jason's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and the air in the room suddenly felt thick, suffocating. His mind raced, but all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, unsure if what he was seeing was real. Sharon and Tom. This couldn't be happening. His best friend's husband. Sharon's best friend's husband. It didn't make sense. He had never once suspected Tom. In fact, they'd had dinner together just a week ago. The whole idea felt impossible, yet the evidence was staring him in the face. Jason set the phone down, his hands trembling. The room felt colder now. He tried to calm himself, to think rationally, but all he could do was replay that message in his mind. It wasn't just a mistake or a misinterpretation. It was deliberate. Sharon was having an affair with Tom. He didn't know what to do next. Should he confront her? Should he wait for more proof? But what more did he need? The message was clear. His world, the life he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling around him. Jason couldn't sleep that night. The weight of what he had discovered kept him awake, turning over and over in his mind. Sharon's betrayal. Tom's role in all of this. It was hard to grasp, as if he were trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. His fingers still tingled from the touch of Sharon's phone, the words on the screen now burned into his memory. He spent the rest of the night in a daze, unable to focus on anything. The hours ticked by slowly, and he found himself replaying the message over and over, questioning the truth of it. But deep down, he knew what he had seen. There was no mistaking it. The next few days felt like a blur. Jason went to work, took care of the kids, did what he had to do to keep up appearances, but inside, his world was collapsing. He could barely look at Sharon without thinking of Tom. How could they do this? How could she betray him, their family, their entire life together? He knew he needed more proof. The message from Tom was damning, but Jason needed to know for certain. So he started looking through Sharon's things, carefully, quietly. It felt wrong, but at this point, he felt like he had no choice. His trust had been shattered, and he couldn't move forward without understanding the full extent of the betrayal. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Jason sifted through Sharon's purse. He found a receipt for a hotel stay from a few weeks ago, a date that didn't align with any event she had mentioned. The room had been booked under a different name, but Jason recognized the address. It was a hotel he and Sharon had passed by several times on their way out of town. The sinking feeling in his chest deepened. The next day, when Sharon was out at her art gallery, Jason logged into their shared computer, knowing she wouldn't be home for hours. He opened her email, feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt, but at this point, he had no choice. He scanned her inbox for any sign of communication with Tom. It didn't take long to find more emails, ones that were far too intimate for comfort. Words of longing. Plans to meet up. Promises to keep it secret. Everything he had feared, confirmed. Jason's hands shook as he closed the computer. He felt sick. His heart ached, but it was something deeper than heartbreak, something raw and unfamiliar. Betrayal. The woman he had loved for over a decade, the woman he thought was his partner, had chosen to hurt him. And not only that, she had chosen to hurt him with Tom, someone he had considered a friend. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of emotion. Anger surged in his veins, but there was also an overwhelming sense of sadness. How could Sharon, the woman he had built a life with, do this to him? How could she risk everything for an affair? Jason didn't know what to do next. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront Sharon just yet. Part of him wanted to scream, to accuse her right then and there, but another part of him, one that was still trying to protect the family he had built, needed to process it. He needed a plan. That night, after dinner with the kids, Sharon came into the living room, her usual smile on her face. But Jason could hardly look at her. His mind was clouded with images of her and Tom, of the lies she had told him, of the way she had concealed the affair for months. And yet, she still sat there, unaware that he knew. She sat down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. Jason didn't flinch, but inside, it was all he could do to keep from pushing her away. He felt so far from her now, even though they were still physically close. The gap between them was growing, and Jason knew that soon, they wouldn't be able to pretend anymore. "I'm so glad we're having this time together," Sharon said, leaning her head on his shoulder. She sounded genuine, even though Jason knew she was anything but. Jason's heart clenched. He had to confront her. He couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. But the words didn't come just yet. His thoughts were racing. What was he supposed to say? What was the right way to tear apart everything they had worked for? He wasn't ready. Not yet. But soon. Jason couldn't shake the growing pit in his stomach. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at him with every passing minute. He had spent days in a kind of daze, walking around in a fog, knowing what he knew, but unsure how to act on it. His heart had been torn in two, and he had to face Sharon. He could no longer hide behind the silence or pretend things were okay. But how? That night, he couldn't sleep. The weight of it all, the lies, the deceit, the secret affair, pressed down on him like 1,000 bricks. He turned over in bed, his mind racing. At one point, he heard Sharon's soft breathing beside him, oblivious to the storm that raged inside him. How could she? How could she lay there, knowing what she had done, and not feel the same crushing weight? Jason knew what he had to do. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he had to confront her. For the past few days, he'd been trying to summon the courage to speak the words that would shatter everything, but now there was no more running. He had the proof, the undeniable evidence. He had to face the truth. The next day, he made arrangements for the kids to spend the evening with his mother. He needed time, space, and privacy for what was about to happen. When Sharon asked why the kids were going to Grandma's house, he kept it casual. "Just need some alone time," he said, trying to mask the tension in his voice. As the day dragged on, Jason felt like he was suffocating. His mind kept going over the details, the evidence he'd found, and how he would approach her. He knew he couldn't yell or attack her in anger, though every part of him wanted to. He had to stay calm, no matter how much his heart hurt. He didn't want to be a man who reacted out of rage. No, he needed control. He needed clarity. That evening, when Sharon returned from the gallery, Jason was already sitting in the living room, waiting for her. She looked surprised to see him there, sitting in the dimly lit room, his face tense. There was a strange heaviness in the air, something Sharon couldn't quite place. "Jason? What's going on?" Sharon asked, setting her bag down on the counter, her voice light, yet with a hint of curiosity. She seemed unaware, still distant in her own world. Jason stood up, his chest tight. He needed to say it. He couldn't keep pretending. "Sharon, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Sharon's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. She took a step forward, but Jason held up a hand to stop her. "I know what's been going on." Sharon froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came out at first. The air between them grew thick with unspoken truths. Jason could see the panic start to settle on her face, but he wasn't going to back down now. This was it. "I know about you and Tom," Jason continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I found the messages. The emails. The hotel receipts. Don't try to deny it, Sharon. I've seen everything." The room felt still. Jason could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Sharon's face paled, and her eyes darted away from him, like she was searching for an escape that didn't exist. "Jason, I'm so sorry," she began, her voice trembling. She stepped closer to him, reaching for his hand, but he pulled it away, unable to touch her without feeling disgusted. "Sorry," Jason repeated, his voice rising just slightly. "Is that all you can say? You've been lying to me, hiding this from me for months, and now you're just sorry." Sharon broke down into tears, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I never meant for it to happen. It was a mistake. I didn't know how to stop it. Tom and I—" "Stop," Jason cut her off. He was shaking now, but it wasn't with rage. It was with the heartbreak that he had been holding in for days, months, maybe even years. "You didn't know how to stop it. Sharon, you were my wife. We had a family. You could have come to me. You could have talked to me. But instead, you chose to sleep with my best friend's husband. You chose to destroy everything we built together." Sharon's sobs only grew louder, but Jason was no longer moved by her tears. He had spent too long trying to understand her, to understand why she had done this. But now, the truth was out, and there was no going back. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," Jason said, his voice trembling with a mixture of pain and resolve. "I don't know if I ever will." Sharon collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "Please, Jason, don't leave me. Please." Jason took a step back, shaking his head slowly. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to look at you the same way again. You've destroyed everything." For a moment, the only sound in the room was Sharon sobbing, and Jason stood there, numb, feeling the weight of everything that had just been broken. He wanted to scream. He wanted to yell at her, at Tom, at the whole world. But all he could do was stand there, feeling the cold, unyielding truth wrap itself around him like chains. His life was never going to be the same again. The days following the confrontation with Sharon were some of the hardest Jason had ever endured. It was as though the world had shifted beneath his feet, and he was standing on unstable ground, unsure which way to go. Every corner of the house reminded him of the life he had once thought was perfect, the family dinners, the weekend mornings, the shared smiles and laughter. Now, all of it felt like a lie. Sharon, for her part, was a wreck. She begged and pleaded with Jason for forgiveness, but her words fell on deaf ears. Jason had heard her apology 1,000 times in their marriage, but it was hollow now. How could he believe her? How could he trust anything she said after the betrayal that had cut so deep? He spent most of his time alone in his office, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of the mess his life had become. He had to make decisions now, decisions that would affect not only him but his children, too. They needed him to be strong, to figure out what the next step would be. But Jason had never felt more broken. The silence between him and Sharon was deafening. They barely spoke except for the occasional exchanges about the children. Even then, it felt forced, like they were two strangers occupying the same space. Sharon continued to cry herself to sleep, but Jason couldn't bring himself to comfort her. Not after what she had done. He couldn't stop thinking about Tom either. The man who had been his best friend. The one who had sat at his kitchen table for years, laughing, joking, and sharing drinks after long days at work. How could he have done this? How could he have crossed that line with Sharon? Jason hadn't yet confronted Tom. Part of him wasn't sure if he ever would. The rage he felt toward him was all-consuming, but he also felt a deep sense of betrayal that went beyond anger. Tom had been like a brother to him, and now, that bond was shattered, just like his marriage. One afternoon, Jason found himself standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. His once confident and assured self was now a shadow of who he had been. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The weight of everything, his broken marriage, the lies, the deceit, had taken its toll on him. How had it come to this? For the first time since the confrontation, Jason found himself asking a question that he hadn't dared to consider before: what now? He thought about the children. They were his anchor, his reason to keep going. They deserved better than this fractured version of their family. But how could he provide that when everything felt like it was falling apart? That night, as the house settled into quiet, Sharon came to him. She had been distant, but there was something different in her approach this time, something raw, something desperate. She stood at the doorway of his office, her face streaked with tears. "Jason. I can't keep living like this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I want to make things right. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I can't lose you." Jason looked at her, his heart torn. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, to pretend that everything could go back to the way it was before. But he couldn't. The trust had been shattered beyond repair. He wasn't sure what the future held, but it wasn't one where he could stand by her, not like this. "I don't know what to do with you, Sharon," Jason said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. What we had, it's gone. And I don't know if I can get it back." Sharon collapsed onto the floor in front of him, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Jason. I love you. I made a terrible mistake. I was selfish. I was confused. But I love you." Jason's heart twisted, and he found himself standing there, frozen, not knowing how to react. He had never been one to hold on to grudges, but this was different. What Sharon had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate betrayal of everything they had built. She had shattered the trust between them, and trust, Jason knew, was the foundation of any relationship. Without it, what were they? He took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil inside him. I need time, Sharon. I can't give you an answer now. I need space to think, to figure this out. I'm not promising anything. Sharon nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked. She stood up slowly, wiping her eyes, before leaving him alone in the office once again. Jason didn't move for what felt like hours, sitting in the darkness, grappling with his emotions. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were decisions to be made, difficult decisions. And whatever path he chose, his life would never be the same. But Jason had always believed in growth, in finding a way forward. He didn't know what that would look like just yet, but he was determined to figure it out. Not for Sharon. Not for Tom. But for himself. He had to find a way to heal, to move forward, and most importantly, to rebuild the trust that had been destroyed. It was time to decide whether or not he could ever forgive Sharon, and if he couldn't, what kind of future they would have, apart. The days that followed were quiet, filled with a silence that was suffocating. Jason had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who could make decisions, fix problems, and move forward. But now, with his life in pieces, he found himself paralyzed, stuck between a past that no longer existed and a future that seemed impossible to imagine. Sharon had given him the space he asked for. She stayed in her room most of the time, only emerging for the bare essentials, meals, the occasional brief conversation about the children. She looked broken, but Jason knew that her tears weren't enough. They weren't enough to fix the damage she had done, and they certainly weren't enough to heal his heart. Jason spent most of his time thinking, reflecting on the choices he had made. He thought about their early years together, how they had met, fallen in love, and built a life. He thought about their children, and what they deserved. His heart ached for them, for the family they used to be. The laughter, the love, the support. Could it all be salvaged? Or was that life gone forever? He couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal. It consumed him in ways he couldn't describe. It wasn't just Sharon who had hurt him, it was Tom, too. The man who had been his best friend, who had sat at his kitchen table for years, who had shared his thoughts, his hopes, his struggles. Tom had betrayed him, too. Jason had thought of confronting him, but a part of him didn't want to give Tom that satisfaction. What would he even say? How could he look at Tom, knowing what they had done? After a week of silence, Jason finally found the courage to take the next step. He couldn't live in this limbo forever. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to Sharon either. So, one evening, after dinner, he asked her to sit down with him. Sharon, we need to talk, he said, his voice calm, but resolute. His heart was still raw, but there was a clarity in his eyes now that had been missing before. Sharon looked up from her plate, her expression cautious, but hopeful. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Jason to decide whether they would try to rebuild what they had or whether it was time to let go. She didn't know which outcome she feared more. I've been thinking a lot, Jason continued. About us. About what happened. And I need you to understand something. What you did, what we both did, isn't something I can just brush aside. It's not something that can be forgotten. Sharon nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't interrupt. She knew Jason wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for answers. And so was she. But here's the thing, Jason said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I can't keep living in the past. I can't keep holding on to this anger and hurt. I need to move forward. And I need to know if you're willing to do the same. Sharon's breath caught in her throat. I don't know if I deserve that chance, she whispered, her voice shaky. But I want to try. I want to make it right, Jason. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, not yet. But I want to rebuild. I want to earn back your trust. Jason looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. He had thought about this moment so many times over the past week. He had thought about what it would mean for their family, for their future. He had thought about the possibility of moving on, both from Sharon and from the betrayal. He had thought about what it would be like to never see her again, to walk away from everything they had built. But when he looked at her now, sitting there with a look of vulnerability in her eyes, something shifted inside him. He didn't know if they could rebuild what they had. He didn't know if trust could ever be fully restored. But he realized he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "I'm not saying it will be easy," Jason said slowly, the words coming with difficulty. "I'm not saying I'm ready to forgive you right now. But I'm willing to try. For us. For the kids." Sharon let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you, Jason," she whispered. "Thank you." But Jason wasn't done yet. There was something important that needed to be said, something that would help him start the healing process. "Sharon, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. For my own peace of mind. I need to heal, and I need to trust myself again. I need to learn how to move forward, with or without you." Sharon's eyes filled with tears once more. "I understand," she whispered. And with that, they sat in silence. The weight of the decision hung in the air between them. It was a small step, but it was the first step toward healing. They didn't know what the future held, or whether they could truly repair the damage. But in that moment, they both knew that they had a choice to make. A choice to try, together, or apart. Jason didn't have all the answers. He didn't know if their marriage could survive this betrayal. But he knew that, for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. Maybe they could find a way forward, one step at a time. And so, with a heavy heart but a mind that was slowly finding clarity, Jason decided to take that first step toward healing. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he was ready to face it. Whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms, with the strength to rebuild, not just his marriage, but his own sense of self. And that, for Jason, was enough. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. And remember, no matter what you're facing, you're not alone. Stay strong, and take things one step at a time.